So last time we talked about Clinton, and he had a bunch of scandals at the end of his presidency, mainly Monica Lewinsky's sex scandal. His vice president was Al Gore. Even though Clinton had these scandals, he was still fairly popular. The economy was really, really good under Bill Clinton. So as long as the economy is good, typically the president or the party that's in charge will kind of stay in charge. That's one thing they keep hammering about. One of the reasons that Biden was able to beat Trump this year is because the economy, even though it was good with the coronavirus, it was on a downward trend, and he was able to take advantage of that.
It's good now.
This guy right here is a guy by the name of Ralph Nader. He was a candidate for the Green Party. The Green Party is the far left wing of the Democratic Party. So it's liberals, but it's mainly people who are very passionate about the environment. Ralph Nader is a guy who wrote a book in the 1970s talking about how if the Ford Pinto, if you bought a Ford Pinto and you were in an accident and you got hit from behind, the Ford Pinto exploded. That's why they quit selling the Ford Pinto. Because if you got hit from the back and going like 20 miles an hour, it exploded like 75% of the time. So he wrote a big book about that. He got Ford to stop producing the Pinto, and he's been viewed as a consumer advocate, somebody that stands up for everyday people to make sure that big companies aren't ripping them off. And the Republicans chose W. He was H.W. Bush's son. He owned the Texas Rangers at one point. He was the governor of Texas. So, one of the things, it was, like, you've lived through one of the most interesting elections in modern history. The election this year between Trump and Biden was wild, honestly, compared to this. If you've ever heard George W. Bush, not really inspiring. If you've ever heard Al Gore talk, just don't. If you have a chance to go see Al Gore talk, just don't. That's all I can tell you. Because it's really, really boring. So, it's two boring guys talking on the news about boring things like budget surpluses. Not a super high voter turnout, not a lot of passion about this one way or the other. Bush wanted big tax cuts, especially for the wealthier Americans, fairly standard Republican ideal. Oops, sorry. Gore wanted smaller tax cuts, pay down the debt some more, and increase support for Social Security and Medicare. So, fairly standard Democratic ideas. There's your map. Now, I know that the election this year was close, and I know that the result was contested, but Bush and Gore was actually much closer. It came down to one state, Florida. At one point, it looked like Bush was going to win Florida. Al Gore called him, said, hey, congratulations on the win. And then a whole bunch of votes came in after that fact, and Al Gore called him back and said, hey, not so fast. So it all came down to Florida, and there was a tie, basically. It was literally like, bless you. It was basically a tie. It was about 400 to 500 votes in between those two things. So they had a recount. So the recount wasn't ordered by the federal government. It's Florida state law. When you have an election that close, you need to have a recount. Okay. Now, as they went through it, they discovered a lot of irregularities with the ballot. You can see right here, there's the ballot. The way that ballots used to work is you go into a machine, you depress the thing that you wanted, and then you'd pull a lever, and it'd punch out on a paper card the ballot. So you'd pick Al Gore, and then you'd pick, Governor whomever, Jeb Bush, and then you'd pick whatever, and then you'd pull the lever, and it punched the paper out. And so what happened was, then you put all these ballots into a machine, and the machine would count them. Well, if the paper didn't get punched all the way out the back, or if it was still hanging on to the ballot, those ballots got rejected. And it was called a hanging chad. So there was a whole bunch of confusion about who actually won. They had to recount the votes. And all those ballots that got thrown out, do you count them? Do you not count them? They had a whole bunch of legal mumbo jumbo going about. It was a bit of a mess. It ended up in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided that the Florida recount was unconstitutional. It's the first time, really, and you've kind of noticed it this year, but states can kind of they run the elections however they want. And one of the things that Trump wanted to have happen is he wanted the Supreme Court to step in and rule, much like they did in Bush v. Gore, that this wasn't allowed, that wasn't allowed, and all these different things. But after this, the Supreme Court took a lot of heat. So then, as the recounts were coming and coming and coming in and whatever, the governor of Florida, who just happened to be George W. Bush's brother, said, okay, my brother wins. So you got George W. Vice President was Dick Cheney. Fun fact about Dick Cheney, he went bird hunting and shot his friend in the face. His friend lived. What's that? Well, so here's how powerful Dick Cheney is. Dick Cheney went hunting with this guy, and he shot him in the face. And 2 days later, the guy he shot in the face came on national TV and apologized for getting shot in the face. That's a true story. Like, I shouldn't have been walking there. It was my fault. There was a bird that got up, and I wasn't paying attention. It was comical, honestly. George W. had a couple things going for him as a president. He was well liked. He was a likable human being. Not a very good speaker. Okay, not a very good speaker at all. So one of the things, Bushisms. So he had a whole bunch of things that he said that were odd. Our enemies are inventive and resourceful. So are we. They never stop thinking about new ways to harm our country or people. And neither do we. My personal favorite, not my personal favorite. There's one that's better. I like, you teach a child to read, and he or her will be able to pass a literacy test. Feels like fairly common sense. This is my personal favorite. There's an old saying in Tennessee. I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee too. They say, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me, can't get fooled again. The saying is, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So, he's an interesting guy. Not an eloquent speaker at all. Which brings us back to this guy, Ralph Nader. So much like when we talked about Bill Clinton and H.W. Bush, Ross Perot swung the election for Bill Clinton. Ralph Nader did the same thing to Al Gore. If Ralph Nader wouldn't have won, Al Gore more than likely would have won the election. Gore got more votes than Bush, but you can see right there, you need 270 to win. Bush got 271. Gore had 266. Bless you again. So, a couple other things that George W. Bush did that were unique. He was the first presidential spokesman for the truly Christian conservative. We talked about Reagan. Reagan talked, he wasn't, he represented a lot of those things, but he didn't speak on them like George Bush did. George W. Bush. Okay? So Reagan and Bush Sr. were both politicians. They had this Christian conservative beliefs, but George W. actually talked about a lot of the religious things, as Jesus being his personal savior and all those things. He would mention those in speeches that he gave. Not only did he talk about him a lot, but he was one of the first presidents to actually financially support some of these things. So there's a handful of faith-based social welfare programs out there that he would pump more support into, and then he started pulling support, financial support, from certain organizations like Planned Parenthood and other countries that began to allow abortions or were already allowing abortions. So he was, even though all Republican presidents since Roe versus Wade have been anti-abortion, he was the first president that's really stepped up and tried to swing the balance of Roe versus Wade. He opposed stem cell research. He denied global warming. Like most Republican presidents when they take office, he cut taxes. So when he took over, there was a budget surplus. He cut about 1.3 trillion, that's with a TR. And the budget surplus in the 1990s turned into a $400 billion deficit by 2004. Now, it wasn't just the tax cut. There was also a war on terror. There's a whole bunch of other things that played into it, but the tax cuts certainly didn't help. 2004, Bush ran for office against that guy, John Kerry. Again, Bush won 286 electoral votes. Kerry had 252. Okay? Again, Florida was the main state. Bush won Florida. If Kerry wins Florida, Kerry wins the election. The electoral map looks almost exactly the same. The difference is Al Gore did a little bit better in the Mid-South because he's from Tennessee originally. One of the things that happened shortly after Bush's second term of office started was Hurricane Katrina. It was the biggest natural disaster in the United States history. Over 1,800 people died, and the city of New Orleans was largely destroyed. There's the reason why the city of New Orleans was destroyed. You can see right there, you got the banks of the Mississippi, and this is where the city of New Orleans sits. So soon, and they have all these retaining walls to keep the water out of the city. Well, once those retaining walls were breached, that was that. And you see all the water there. You can see the Superdome. The other thing that's unique about New Orleans, I don't know if it's unique, it's a little bit gross, but New Orleans, because the water table is so high in New Orleans, when they have a funeral, they bury people above ground. because you can't, like, if you dig in 6 feet, it's just pure water. And so if you go to New Orleans, if you've ever been to New Orleans, they have a whole bunch of cemeteries, and they're very ornate, and they have like metal, or not metal, but they have like concrete boxes where they actually put people. With the flood, it wiped out a lot of those cemeteries. So you had dead people floating through New Orleans, which was not ideal. And we'll stop there. We'll stop on that happy note. No, we got 2 more. I lied to you. So, one of the issues that happened when New Orleans flooded was FEMA didn't have a very good director. It wasn't necessarily George W. Bush's fault that he didn't have a very good director, but FEMA basically blew it. Like, hey, we got something really bad going on. What should we do? And he's like, I don't know. Well, we need to do something. The city of New Orleans is flooding. Okay. And then it took about 2 weeks for him to actually set a plan in place and actually start helping people. It was a mess. And then, like we talked about, I mentioned earlier, by September of 2008, with the war on terror going, with some of the things that were happening, the United States economy started to decline. There was high oil prices, again, a result from the war on terror. There was inflation, that is the same thing that hampered Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter and George H.W. Bush. But the thing that ruined the economy was the housing bubble. You had a whole bunch of people living in houses that weren't worth what they paid for them, and they couldn't afford to keep paying. But it's one of those deals where you didn't have to really have, like, when you apply for a car loan or when you buy your first house or whatever, they're going to run your credit score and they're going to see what your credit score is. And back in the early 2000s, it didn't matter what your credit score was. They just give you a loan. And what they do is they give you a loan and they'd have variable interest. So you might be at a 5% interest rate for the first year of your loan, and then the interest rates would change, and all of a sudden you're paying 20%. So now it's like a credit card payment. And people were buying $1 million houses that were worth $350,000 and paying ridiculous interest rates. And they were defaulting on these loans. And as they defaulted on these loans, other banks started to buy them and sell them off and make money on them. And it all kind of caught up and ruined the economy. So that's where we're at today. The last thing for today, this is obviously the last thing. Bush, because the economy was in the bank, and because there was a handful of banks that had already failed, and that was the cause of the Great Depression in the 1930s, or one of the causes of the Great Depression in the 1930s, Bush passed something that was called the Troubled Asset Relief Program, known as TARP. So he gave the banks a whole bunch of money, he gave companies a whole bunch of money to make sure that they wouldn't close down. And he got a lot of heat from it from his Republican counterparts.